Hello, I'm going to be talking today about the risks and benefits of cannabis and cannabinoids, especially to treat chronic pain. My disclosure slide, notice here, I went to the University in Michigan in the 1970s. I say that in jest, but as someone who's been talking to physicians and other healthcare providers about cannabinoids for almost a decade now, certainly when I began to talk, most people's perceptions about cannabis were really heavily formed based on whether they themselves use cannabis recreationally earlier in life. I like starting by showing you the two ends of the continuum, whether you either think cannabinoids are useful for medicinal use or useless. I am a pain researcher. We like using visual analog scales. So I made a visual analog scale where the people that thought that cannabis or cannabinoids were worthless were on the reefer madness end of the continuum, and the ones who thought it was very wonderful were on the Cheech and Chong end of the continuum. But I want to play a brief clip from Reefer Madness because I think it's really important to understand sort of where some of the stigmas and misconceptions about cannabis began. This is a movie that was produced originally in the mid-1930s.
Boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently they dance, innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case.
If you want a good smoke, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, if you're afraid.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict.
Plague bastard.
Hopeless insanity. See this important film now, before it is too late.
So I hope you enjoyed that. So what I'll do is first start with some definitions and background. Then I'll talk about some of the potential benefits of cannabinoids, the risks of cannabinoids, the roles in treating chronic pain, and then a summary. So first, terminology. There's a lot of terms here that people may or may not understand. So the term cannabis is actually a genus of flowering plants. And this is now the preferred term. The word marijuana has sort of racist undertones. And so people are really trying and using that term a lot less and using the actual name of the plant a lot more. There were originally 3 distinct species of cannabis: indica, sativa, and ruderalis. But with now all inbred strains and things like that, it's less clear that there are these different species. But what the indica and sativa and ruderalis strains differ in is the relative concentrations of different cannabinoids within cannabis, and I'll talk about some of those. The 2 cannabinoids I'm going to talk the most about, because they're the ones we know about, are THC and CBD, and I'll define those in a minute. But we know that, for example, the indica strains of cannabis are thought to be more sedating, and the sativa strains of cannabis are thought to be more activating. So people will take these during the day, not because of different concentrations of THC and CBD, but because of different concentrations of the 80 or so other minor cannabinoids besides THC and CBD that we really don't understand very well at all. So cannabis can also be bred to have very low amounts of psychoactive material THC, and this is what hemp is. Hemp, a long time ago, was bred specifically to not have THC so that it could be used for industrial purposes. And this causes one of the first areas of confusion legally in the United States is that cannabidiol, which is still present in high concentration in hemp, or CBD, can either be derived from hemp or can be derived from cannabis. The CBD or cannabidiol that is derived from hemp in the United States is legal in all 50 states as of a couple of years ago because of the US hemp laws. CBD that is derived from cannabis is still a Schedule I drug and is still illegal federally in every state, although many states have either passed laws legalizing cannabis or allowing for the medicinal use of cannabis. So that's all very confusing, but it's important to remember that there is now a legitimate way for people to get cannabidiol or CBD federally and legally, whereas that's not present with THC, even though we have a state law in Michigan that allows you to possess cannabis. You theoretically could be charged under federal law because federal law still considers that to be a controlled substance. Sativex is an oral spray that is a 1-to-1 cannabis extract that is approved for use for multiple sclerosis and pain in other countries, but is not available in the United States. The term cannabinoid is a different meaning, and this is really actually anything that binds to the cannabinoid receptors within the human body. So you may or may not know this, but just like we have opioid receptors in our body that bind to the endogenous opioids that we release that are called endorphins and enkephalins, we similarly have cannabinoid receptors in our body, two different types, CB1 and CB2 receptors. And these receptors bind to the endogenous ligands that are produced by our body that are THC-like compounds that are released in different areas of our body to engender the different effects that the endocannabinoid system has in the human body. Phytocannabinoids are plant-derived cannabinoids, whereas again, endocannabinoids are our own internal cannabinoids. These would be akin to endorphins. Synthetic cannabinoids obviously are cannabinoids that are synthesized, things like K-spice. These are generally drugs of abuse, although now synthetic cannabinoids are being made by pharmaceutical companies and as an attempt to harness the cannabinoid system to treat conditions. And then finally, these different receptors, I'll talk a little bit about them. The CB1 receptors are primarily in the central nervous system, but not in the brainstem. So because there are no cannabinoid receptors in the brainstem, cannabinoid overdoses do not cause respiratory depression like opioid and alcohol and benzodiazepine overdoses. And so this is one of the, if you will, the nice things about cannabinoids is they don't have the overdose potential of some other drugs. The CB2 receptors are mainly found in the periphery on immune and nerve cells. So again, CB1 receptors mainly central nervous system, CB2 mainly peripheral immune cells. And then finally, these are the names of the endogenous ligands. Again, this would be comparable to endorphins and enkephalins, that there are a bunch of them. There are a bunch of endogenous endocannabinoids that are released in different areas of the body and bind to the CB1 and CB2 receptors throughout your body. Not surprisingly, there are enzymes that break down these different endogenous cannabinoids as well. And this is also an area of drug development. Pharmaceutical companies are trying to develop drugs that inhibit these receptors. And by inhibiting these receptors, that would lead to higher levels of these endogenous cannabinoids. So instead of giving someone a drug like THC, you could give them a drug that blocks the enzyme that breaks down their own internal THC, and those drugs theoretically might have less side effects. The cannabinoid system is widely distributed throughout the body. So if you give someone a drug and you intend it to bind the CB1 or CB2 receptors to treat pain, it's going to bind a lot of other CB1 and 2 receptors that are doing a lot of other things. And this is a lot of the same problems that we have with giving opioids to treat pain, is they don't just bind to the receptors and just for the purpose that to treat pain. These receptor systems do a lot of other things. And if you give someone a cannabinoid, you would cause side effects or off-target effects in a lot of these different areas. And so this is why I wrote about this with respect to opioids, that when people are on chronic opioid therapy, it's so hard to get them off because they become dependent on the opioids. Their body is used to those opioids that they're taking in pill form, and they then need more and more opioids just to feel better. The same thing happens with cannabinoids, and this may be one of the reasons that we see very clear signals that a low amount of THC seems to work a lot better to treat pain than a high amount of THC, just like the lower amounts of opioid for shorter periods of time can be very effective analgesics. I often say that the longer you use an opioid at the higher the dose, the less well that it works for pain. Some of the things that we know that the endocannabinoid system does, and theoretically giving someone a cannabinoid could do, the endocannabinoid system impairs short-term memory. One of the reasons that there are multiple studies of cannabis ongoing to treat PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder is the intrusive short-term memories might be reduced by using cannabinoids. Cannabinoids can actually improve neurogenesis, and in a couple studies have suggested that in individuals with head trauma or severe neurologic trauma, people that were using cannabinoids did better than people that weren't. They can increase appetite. This is one of the approved uses in the United States. Is Marinol is approved for use as an appetite suppressant and HIV wasting. They can treat pain. They can improve immune function, and they can transiently reduce stress. Most of these effects that I just talked about are mediated by the CB1 receptors, not the CB2 receptors. Again, CB2 receptors are receptors in the periphery that are involved in reducing inflammation. So now I've talked a little bit about these things, but THC, which also there are synthetic forms that you could prescribe, Marinol and dronabinol are approved drugs in the United States, not approved for use in pain, but approved. These are synthetic THC. And that although THC binds relatively equally to CB1 and CB2 receptors, most of the activity of THC that we know of seems to be via its CB1 activity. And this is the primary psychoactive cannabinoid in cannabis, and it is also what's being identified in a drug test. Cannabidiol, or CBD, in contrast to THC, seems to be very well tolerated. It's not psychoactive. It doesn't bind with any significant affinity to any other cannabidiol receptors. And so we don't actually know how cannabidiol works, other than knowing that it is in fact a cannabinoid. It actually might even protect against some of the psychoactive effects of THC. So it often is a good idea when someone is using a cannabis-based product to use a high CBD product, even if they are using some THC as well, but the CBD in the background may actually protect against some of the high or the euphoria from the THC, which for a medicinal user is a side effect, not a beneficial effect. And so that right now, the synthetic forms of THC are approved both as an antiemetic, as an anorexic in the United States. Neurologists and others that treat a lot of multiple sclerosis really think it's a quite effective anti-spasticity agent in MS. They're probably more excited about its anti-spasticity effects than its analgesic effects. I think you all are aware that several forms of cannabidiol alone now are approved for use as an anticonvulsant in the US for rare congenital forms of epilepsy that affect children. I'll talk about this particular form called Epidiolex. It may be neuroprotective, there may be anti-tumor effects. These are a lot more speculative. So what are some of the risks? A lot of the risks are due to the route of administration. We're strongly recommending against people smoking or vaping cannabis for medicinal use. Certainly, if they are going to use the respiratory route of administration, they probably should be vaping instead of the way when I was going to college in the 70s, we used to smoke pot. But the oral route of administration, topical, transdermal are probably all preferred. And so we really are strongly recommending against people smoking cannabis. The other problem, and I'll talk about in a minute, is that the cannabis smoked makes the drug level go up very rapidly, which gives you more euphoria, makes it more likable, and makes it more likely someone might become dependent or addicted to cannabis. This happens less commonly with cannabis, than a lot of other drugs of abuse, but nonetheless, when we're using them for medicinal purposes, route of administration does make a big difference, and that's why we prefer, for example, the oral routes of administration. It's very difficult, if you will, to die directly from a cannabis overdose. The few deaths that have been reported probably are people that were severely paranoid or tachycardic associated with overdose and developed a myocardial infarction. We do know that early exposure to cannabis early in life increases someone's risk of developing a psychotic-like illness. This is a high relative risk, but a low absolute risk. This risk can be modified by childhood trauma, family history of psychotic illness. We also know that there are short-term effects on brain function. When people use very high amounts of cannabis long periods of time, there probably are long-term effects as well. We don't really think that the amounts of cannabis we might be using medicinally are causing long-term cognitive effects, but we really don't know. That hasn't been studied as well as it could be studied. Again, respiratory route of administration is not at all preferred. And dependence can occur, but it occurs much less commonly than other drugs of abuse. If you compare apples to apples, using similar metrics, about 9% of people that exposed to cannabis get either addicted or get a use disorder, whereas 32% of people with nicotine, 15% of alcohol, and 23% with opioids. Any exposure to cannabis earlier in life is a lot more problematic. And one of the things that all of us worry a lot about with legalization of cannabis is whether there's more access to youth and adolescents. There almost certainly is. I mean, it's not clear yet whether that's causing problems or not. This is just a slide showing the different drugs of abuse, and the cannabis, it can be addictive, but it's considerably less addictive than most other drugs. There might be a risk of smoking cannabis and oral cancers in the head and neck. There also might be a risk of a rare type of testicular cancer in people with frequent marijuana use or cannabis use. But again, medicinal use wouldn't be expected to lead to any such problems. Cannabis does impair reaction time, not nearly as much as alcohol, but driving while impaired is dangerous. The latest statistics suggest that when a state legalizes cannabis use, there's a slight increase in motor vehicle accidents, usually no increase in fatalities. This is a joke, but it's largely true. People that are high have a tendency to drive carefully and too slow, contrast to people that are drunk who drive very fast. And so again, I'm not recommending driving while high, but it doesn't have some of the problems that driving while drunk has. There are a lot of conflicting data about whether cannabinoids are effective for pain. A lot of studies suggest that they are. So a lot of reviews have said, yes, cannabinoids can be effective for pain, but if you look more closely at these studies, they're all over the place. It's not all pain, it's not all cannabis. And so I'll try to tell you what we think is really going on here. But before talking about THC, I want to talk about CBD or cannabidiol. Cannabidiol, in addition to being a cannabinoid, it seems to have anti-inflammatory effects, and it may be acting in some settings as an analgesic because of its anti-inflammatory effects. For example, there's some data suggesting it might be helpful in osteoarthritis. This is a study of transdermal CBD rubbed through the skin in osteoarthritis, suggesting that it could be effective. But this is going back to the route of administration that I was talking about earlier, that the reason that drugs of abuse are injected or smoked or snorted is the level goes up very high and comes down very rapidly. When it goes up very high, that's what causes people to be high. The more rapid the drug level goes up, the more high people get, which is why they snort or inject or chug to get more euphoria from drugs of abuse. Oral routes of administration don't cause that big spike, so they're not nearly as likely for people to get high. So they're not as likely to become dependent. And it gives a much longer half-life. And so this is why the oral route of administration is really preferred for medicinal use. This is also showing that the oral route of administration causes a lot less likability. Again, THC isn't really injected clinically, but experimentally in this study, it was if you inject it or smoke it, the level goes up very rapidly, and people really feel high and like it, whereas oral administration takes so long for it to work that they really feel a lot less high for the same amount of THC. And I already alluded to this as well, this U-shaped curve. What this means is that lower amounts of THC seem to work better for pain than higher amounts. And in people that are going to dispensaries in the state of Michigan and elsewhere, and without any kind of guidance, just getting THC off the shelf, they're often getting very high THC concentration THC, and this probably leads them to get high without leading them to get pain relief, because they overshoot the dose that would actually lead to pain relief. Certain types of pain are more likely to respond to cannabinoids than others, and we know that these more centralized pain conditions like fibromyalgia, you're probably going to have to add a little bit of THC for centralized pain or neuropathic pain, whereas CBD alone might be effective for purely nociceptive pain like osteoarthritis. It may be useful in some settings that people, there are a lot of studies suggesting that individuals have substituted cannabis for opioids, and studies suggesting that they've done that and done that to good effect, where they've been able to either lower their opioid dose or eliminate opioids while substituting with cannabis. Again, this isn't the preferred way. We'd rather people come off of any drugs of abuse, but I think I would make the case that if people are on cannabis, the safety is quite a bit higher for them if they're using that for their pain than if they're on chronic opioid therapy for pain. Most people are unaware that even individuals on chronic opioid therapy that are taking prescription opioids have very high rates of all-cause mortality. And again, these are drugs that have a lot of side effects. And so again, I don't love using cannabis to treat pain, because we're still working through some of the dosing issues, especially with THC. But it is an advantage that compared to, this is a poppy plant that the cannabis plant is talking to, that they don't kill people. So to summarize, that when people are thinking about using cannabinoids, first use a cannabinoid or a cannabinoid extract of known and consistent potency. One of the nice things about the laws in states like the state of Michigan is that they do enable people to get high quality cannabinoid products, either CBD alone, THC alone, different formulations. From a safety standpoint, people should try CBD alone. Start at lower dose, go up to higher dose. CBD is not inexpensive, so no reason for people to start at these higher doses, but they should really go up to a couple hundred milligrams a day before they conclude that CBD is ineffective. If CBD alone doesn't work, then they could consider adding a little bit of THC, 5 to 10 milligrams of THC. If someone is cannabis naive, 10 milligrams of THC is probably going to make them high, so they have to start low at 5 milligrams. Again, start low, go slow. Oral dosing is a lot better than any kind of inhaled route of administration. And the type of pain that this might work best for, especially when you add THC, is probably neuropathic pain or centralized pain conditions like fibromyalgia, because there is an increased risk of psychosis, and when cannabis exposure occurs before the age of 25, that we should be particularly careful about recommending or advocating the use of cannabis for people under age 25. So I hope this is very helpful. Thank you.